I am so thankful that even in the middle of a pandemic, theater has been happening. It seems like there's quite a few people that have been involved in producing and creating live virtual digital productions like today's guest, Mark Exline. This is the Backstage Creative. And I'm Krista Copper, and I am so thankful that you're here listening to this. Whether this is your first episode listening or you've been listening for almost 2.5 years, thank you. There's a lot out there to listen to. I'm frequently overwhelmed by the amount of music, and several of my friends have put out albums during the pandemic, and I feel like there's never enough time in the day to listen to all of the great creativity that's been coming out of the past year. Like I said, my guest today is Mark Exline. I know Mark from Creed, Colorado, where we both worked at Creed Repertory Theater for a season. Mark works at one of the main theaters in the Kansas City area where I also live. Mark works at Music Theater Heritage and has been doing some really neat projects during the pandemic, such as dressing this huge Tyrannosaurus Rex statue that's in downtown KC. So it was fun to talk about that. As always, it's fun to catch up with people from different seasons of my life. Yeah, when I talk to guests from that I know from grad school or summer stocks or random theaters that I've worked at over the past decade of being in this industry, it's fun to mentally walk down memory lane and to reminisce and just remember things that I haven't thought about in a while. That is one of the things that I love so much about theater, about music, about art is the people that you get to meet. I was talking to one of my roommates the other day, and we had gone out for coffee, and I said, I miss being exposed to a lot of different people. One of the beautiful things about theater is that it attracts all sorts of people, all sorts of characters and personalities, and people from such different backgrounds. I love it, and I miss it. I miss making those connections and hearing people's stories. And yeah, my world feels so small right now. I don't know if yours feels all the same, but my world just feels tiny and compressed and not as colorful and as vibrant as it used to feel. Lately I've been really restless. I mean, it's the end of February when I'm recording this, and winter isn't quite over yet. So to ease my restlessness, I've been rearranging everything, like rearranging the apps on my phone, rearranging the house plants. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna reorganize the kitchen a little bit, and after I record this, my poor roommates. But yeah, for me, I'm restless. I need something different. I need to change. So I'm not getting that like I used to. I'm not getting that change and that just variety to my day or week or month. So I guess I'll just have to settle for rearranging the apps on my phone. Anyway, like I said, I'm glad that you're here and I'm excited to get to this conversation. So here we go. Here's my conversation with Mark Exline. So what have you been up to these last 11 months?
Oh my goodness, that's a huge, complicated question. So when the pandemic hit, I essentially was put onto a furlough. We were in the middle of tech, actually. Our first full day of tech with actors and everybody. We got shut down in the middle of that tech rehearsal. So
Oh.
we got a notification saying, there's going to be, no more gatherings of more than 10 people at a time. And we said, okay, well, we're all in this room, so we'll finish out the next hour. My boss came in and took pictures, and then we said, thank you, everybody. We will see you hopefully in the future. We don't really know. So then after that, I was furloughed a week and a half later, which was the best possible choice because it means that, I still have a job to go back to. Then I played Skyrim for about 4 months. I logged 750 hours in Skyrim without realizing it. And then I started doing a lot of art for myself. I started doing a lot of making a lot of clothes for myself, doing a lot of painting, and just sort of exploring who I am as an artist outside of the theater, which I only really do when I'm not doing theater because theater takes your entire life. So
Mm-hmm.
this was a great opportunity for me to do that. I also ended up doing a lot of video work for MTH. We switched to an entirely virtual model, so I came in as a contractor to do the production designs for all of the videos, which was the most significant lighting work I've done in many years. And then fell into working over at Union Station doing their Christmas install, which turned into, they call it the holiday install, but it's only Christmas, and which then turned into me starting to make clothes for a T-Rex, which which has fully conquered the last month of my life, where all that I've done is made clothes for a Tyrannosaurus.
That's gonna look so great on a resume, because who else is gonna have that,
Yeah, it's very, very rare that it shows up.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to hear how different artists have handled the pandemic. There's some people I know that are, just posting tons of YouTube videos and completely revamping their website and, just
Mm-hmm.
killing it, practicing for hours and doing all these things. But then there's some people like myself that have just taken a break, and it's been I think refreshing to hear how there hasn't been one way that artists have kind of gotten through this pandemic. But yeah, like we all needed, I think, different things this last year.
Yeah, I really did both, and I kind of needed to go through 4 months of accomplishing literally nothing
Mm-hmm.
to mourn and to process. I started taking online classes for project management because I was thinking, maybe this isn't the time when I switch careers. Maybe now is the time. And I hated it, which is fine. But, I like honestly just cruising through social media like crazy, which I started doing a lot more of during the Black Lives Matter protests, gave me like other people giving me permission to not have to be productive, let me release all of the guilt that I had around not being productive and not doing anything. And then suddenly it all came back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does.
Yeah, I found that the guilt was much more crippling than anything. Just like letting go of that made me much much happier.
Hmm. And I think sometimes, at least for me, I get caught up in like somehow in my mind it's like a race, but we're not in a race. Like we're not racing against each other. So I don't, if you're just not productive because you, like you said, you need that time to mourn or just to step back for a little bit and kind of reevaluate. Like that's fine. It's not a race.
No, exactly. And it's yeah, absolutely.
Hmm. So have you like the digital stuff you've been involved with? Do you think that had pretty been received pretty well?
It has, yeah. So MTH was able to hold on to a little over 60% of our season ticket sales and our pre-sold tickets to
Wow.
shows. Yeah, which is I think really impressive. Because we were afraid, of course, that we would end up giving everything back, which is something we understood at MTH. My boss Tim Scott is really incredible about figuring out like what do we have to do, what do we need to do, what is the right thing to do, and what would be the best circumstance for us. And we ended up somewhere in the middle, which is really lovely. It's partially because we started producing this digital content with the acknowledgement that we had these performers performing live, but the recognition that we weren't going to be able to recreate a live experience. We're able to get a lot closer. We're able to use moving cameras and lighting in different ways and special effects that we wouldn't be able to do live in a theater, because when you eliminate all of the trappings of a theater and an audience in the room, suddenly you simultaneously have a ton more freedom and a lot more limitations.
Yeah, I like that. That there is, you're not losing everything. Sometimes when I think about digital performances, it's just like, oh, we lost everything. But yeah, there is some. I guess I haven't thought too much about that, but yeah, there is. It does open up some things.
Yeah, well, and for me, I'm a theater designer at the end of the day. And it was really important to me when we were creating all of this content that we not move away from the sort of Brechtian production style that we cling to at MTH, that allows us to reveal all of the sort of tricks that we're doing. In the first video, which is by far the one where we were learning the most. That is the kindest way I can say that. There's this section where the song is "Biggest Ball of Twine" by Weird Al Yankovic, and I was like, what if I just drop strings of twine all over this performer as he's performing. And Tim, who is constantly our videographer and editor, just at one point like pans over to me on a ladder, pulling these strings so that they fall onto the actor while he's singing, which is like, it's so incredibly done, but also really, really works in showing like this is still a live show, this is still theater. We're just doing it in a video format. So I'm pretty proud of the way that we've managed to sort of hybridize those things, the sort of kitschy aspects that can exist in the live theatrical performance. We're not animating anything. We're not bringing in somebody to do any CGI. It's like me with some lights and a fog machine and bubbles.
Yeah.
literally bubbles. But what's been cool about that is that people don't feel like they're losing their theater experience. They're still, that's the message that we get all the time, is it felt like I was right there. It felt like I was right there in the room, but you were doing things that you couldn't do before, which is what we had hoped to do and what I had hoped to do as an artist in the circumstance.
Mm-hmm. What are some things that you've learned, working in the digital space?
I've learned that nothing looks the way that it does in real life. As a classically trained theater designer, I am very accustomed to things looking the way that they do in real life and then having to edit photos later so that they look closer to what it really did look like, because cameras are pretty bad at capturing what things look like in the theater, especially because of the way the theatrical lighting works, and especially now with the advent of LEDs. But that's not really an option that you have with video, especially in the circumstance that we're working in, where there's 3 people doing all of the tech and production work on making the video content happen. So it was much more about, I don't like the way that things look in real life sometimes, but I know looking through the camera or looking at the monitor that they look really great and that they look like what we're trying to, give to our audience. So that's been the hardest thing, is learning that my eyes are not exactly the most useful tool in this circumstance anymore, which is a hard lesson to learn. And it's a really distinct difference between video and digital and live performance. I had the privilege last week actually of working on a small film shoot here in town. They asked me if I could build the scenery, and I stopped in and was able to watch as they were setting lighting and as they were adjusting levels and doing testing to make sure that the actors looked the way they wanted them to. I learned a lot just from being in that room about how I want to sort of bring that film practice into our digital theatrical production practice.
So what does the camera like generally do that you have to compensate for?
The camera does 2 things. It blows things completely out, which I don't really know what those words mean. Everybody. What it does is it makes the things that are brightest look really bright, and then everything that's darker looks way darker. So in essence, it just makes everything look like it has a lot more contrast. And if there's too much light in the room, it has trouble. If there's way more light in the room than I would like as a designer, it typically looks better on camera. And that to me is always baffling, because I'm like, no, turn out everything, turn on 3 lights, and that's what's going to make it look good, which is often true. On camera, that just makes it look super contrasty, and it makes everything look like it's a Wagnerian opera or something dark and horrifying, and it's just not always the case. We don't need to be doing film noir when we're trying to put on a happy face or some other kitschy musical number. The other thing is that it completely retranslates color in a way that is difficult for me to understand. I've been told it has something to do with the way that color and light interact with the camera. As a person who doesn't really do well with color and lighting in general, because of course color and light works differently than it does in paint. I paint well. Lighting color combination confuses me. On film and through a camera lens, colors are just different. And the colors that I really live for, which are these sort of deep blues and these deep violets, and things that live in almost the UV spectrum. If you've ever tried to take a picture of anything ultraviolet with your phone, you can see that like your phone just doesn't know what to do with that information. And LED light in general, the camera does the same thing. It has trouble sort of picking that up. Almost like just completely pulls it forward and flattens that area of light in a way that I think could be embraced in a really interesting fashion. But for what I've been doing a lot of lately, it doesn't work super well. I was watching an episode of Star Trek Discovery a few weeks ago, and they had used blue LED in like these wall panels, and I was noticing that like the way that those wall panels existed relative to the entire rest of the image was just baffling. It was like they were cartoon things that didn't exist in the real world, which had everything to do with the way that that light interacted with that camera.
Interesting. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast. I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about how it was in the context of education. Like they were talking about, how everyone's so worried about, especially elementary kids who, haven't had proper socialization that they need. But this person was saying, kids are going to be coming out of school now with a totally different skill set because of what they've gone through with the pandemic. And, instead of looking at it as a negative thing, we need to be looking at the positive things that they are going to be able, the skills that they have learned that, previous generations haven't. And I think it'll be the same with the arts, like people who have, been doing digital productions and trying to find different ways to bring art to people are going to come out of the pandemic with just different skill sets that I think are going to make the art scene, the theater scene, music scene, whatever, richer and more accessible to people.
Yeah, I agree. I think that particularly in theater, we have a lot of issues with like ADA access. I've worked in a few theaters that have had to completely renovate their lobbies because they weren't ADA compliant anymore because the theater was so old. It's impossible to get like a performer with any sort of differing ability backstage often because there's not a clear pathway to make that happen, and it's not an accommodation that a lot of theaters are willing to make. But if we, suddenly we have this opportunity to do digital production, it means that like yes, we absolutely need to be making those accommodations, but we can start bringing people into our shows that weren't able to be part of them before, or we can potentially, if we're distributing our productions both in person and via video, via live stream, or via some other streaming option because we filmed them one time, it means that we can pay people the same rate to be a part of this production whether or not they're available at all times. I think that it has the potential to change the way that we look. The potential to. Do I think that that will happen? Not necessarily. The people in charge of making those decisions will have to change the way that they think about everything, but it does have the potential to change the way that we do all of this and do theater and recognize audiences and audience outreach and performer outreach and hiring. This could change everything about our industry while also allowing us to hold on to the parts that we hold dear.
Agreed. And I really hope as an industry we take hold of those. We're on the brink of something, and we just need the courage to take hold of it. And I hope that we do, when things open back up.
Agreed.
Yeah. Mark, I'd love to hear about your background, where you're from, where you went to school, if you went to school, and just some highlights that led you to where you are now.
Sure. So I grew up in Central Florida. I used to say it was a small town, but I've since lived in much smaller towns. Um, yeah, grew up in Central Florida and then went to undergraduate school, first at Florida School of the Arts and in Palatka, Florida, which is a special little place, as places in Florida tend to be. And then I moved to Knoxville after that, and I worked for the Carpetbag Theater Company, which is a company that my aunt, Linda Paris Bailey, runs. They are a Black-owned and operated theater company doing African American and Appalachian stories in the heart of Appalachia, and they do it beautifully. I worked for her for about 4 months, and then I moved to Greensboro, North Carolina, where I went to Greensboro College, which was a huge learning experience for me because it operated so differently. It was the biggest school I had been to up to that point. And then while I was there, every summer I did summer stock. So I did a summer stock in Pennsylvania at a place called Allenbury, and then I did a summer stock at the Clinton area Showboat in Iowa, and then I went to Lexington Children's Theater where I worked for a hot minute. Goodness, Thunder Bay Theater in northern Michigan in a little town called Alpena. I started once I got to Thunder Bay after leaving Lexington Children's Theater. That was the first place where I was doing design and production. So I was designing shows and all of my degrees, by the way, are in scenic design. That's important to know. So I started doing design and production after undergrad, after Lexington Student Theater, and I would design the shows and I would paint them and I would usually prop them and I would also build them. So I was tapping into all of these different skill sets that I had picked up over all of these years of summer stocks and small schools and all of that jazz. And then I went to a place in Rhode Island, Ocean State Theater Company. If you're puttering around Kansas City, you'll run into Joel Kipper. He's a production manager over at UMKC right now. He ran that company. And then I went to a place in Indiana. I honestly don't remember the name of the theater or the town anymore. And I was all of these positions were for between 4 and 9 months. So it was a really short amount of time actually, between when I finished undergrad at Greensboro College and then started at UMKC, where I started graduate school for scenic design. And once I hit UMKC, everything sort of changed for me. I went from, this puttery little scenic designer who could build and paint stuff to this person that people were interested in working with. I designed a show called Marilyn God and built and painted for the Fish Tank Theater for my very dear friend Heidi Van. That was directed by Jeff Church, lighting design by Danny Lawrence, sound by Jay Shanks. It was a one-woman show about Marilyn Monroe and her auditioning to get into heaven for a jury of her aborted babies. That is a true synopsis of that show. But I went into a meeting and Jeff had suggested that I get involved in the show, and they were like, "Can you build us an embalming table?" And I said, "Sure, but can I just build you a set instead?" And they said, "Absolutely." And it ended up being one of these big cultural moments in Kansas City theater. We won a pitch award that year. My work was called out in a lot of really great reviews, and I've sort of ridden that show since then. It was part of the reason that I ended up in Creed, where we met, doing not scenic design at first, props at first, and then coming back to design for the kids camp programs, and then here in Kansas City, it turned into me doing And Then There Were None, which was a very big, very well-selling show for Kansas City Actors Theater. Once I had finished graduate school, I got a call from my mentor at Florida School of the Arts, who asked me to come back and teach for a year so he could retire. So I did. I got that call right before I went to Creed, and I actually left Creed a little early to go start working. It's a period of my life that I think of as sort of a big mistake. I wish that I hadn't left Creed early to go and start working at this other place that I thought would turn into a long-term position. I was foolish to think that, going back and teaching at a place where you were a student would be sort of flawless. I ignored a lot of red flags in the interview process because I thought that it was important that I, show up and that I, make my mentor look good and that I give him this opportunity to retire when he wanted to. And I ended up signing my contract to come back to Kansas City by January and told them in February that I wouldn't be returning for another year, which I do not regret. That was a good choice. And giving them that notice so they could have plenty of time to find somebody new was a good choice as well. And now I'm back in Kansas City, and I work for a theater company that I really love. I work with people that I really love. I have a lot of respect in the place that I work, and I've been specifically hired because I don't particularly like musicals.
Oh no.
No, it's good. So my boss Tim, when he was interviewing me, he said, "How do you feel about musicals?" And I said, "I don't like them, and here is the thesis length list of reasons why I don't like them." And they're the same reasons that a lot of people don't like musicals, and they're also reasons that people who work in theater don't like musicals. And he said, "Well, that's great. That probably means that if you have to design a musical, you really look for something of value in it." I said, "That's absolutely true." And I do, and I hold on to that, and I demand the same of all of the designers that we work with. because that's what I do. I'm the production manager for Musical Theater Heritage. So all of the designers that come through, have to go through my boss, Tim Scott, the artistic director, producing artistic director, and then they have to go through me as well.
I would love to hear some of the reasons why you don't like musicals.
Okay. So first of all, I think that there's a lot of kitsch associated with musicals that doesn't necessarily have value, because the historical reason that musicals were produced was to sort of pick up where vaudeville left off, right? To turn these variety shows into something new and something more exciting. Well, my issue with that is you can't just slap a narrative on that and then call that a show. That doesn't, like, what happened to the stories that you were telling, and you really weren't. And then it turned into, okay, well, we're going to turn this book, or we're going to turn this, this story or this film into a musical. Okay, that's cool. I totally get that. But we're going to have to make sure that it's palatable for the widest margin of people that exist, which for most of history was white people of a certain tax bracket. The problem with that is that it eliminated stories of people of color and women and immigrants and many people for fucking ever. And sorry, I don't know if I can curse on here.
You sure can.
Great. For fucking ever. And it's gross. And it's been gross. And every time somebody's like, oh, well, we're gonna backtrack, we're gonna redo it, you're not hiring writers of color. You're not hiring composers of color. I kid you not, I spent hours and hours and hours looking for musicals that had been nominated for Tonys, that had been written and or composed by people of color. And I think I found one. And it's just so disgusting, and the way that people talk about musicals is sort of in this religious fashion. Like, they're, musical, they think of musicals as great and beautiful and incredible, but somehow they've like glanced over rape and murder and all of these sort of darker things that do happen in musicals. We were just doing Carousel, and everybody's like, oh, Carousel is great, Carousel is, this massive success, and it's this beautiful, lovely story. And it's not. This dude, Billy Bigelow, is this abusive monster, and that we somehow like spend all of our time watching and focusing on, and that's what people want to talk. Like, I just can't. It's and I must say, like, there are people who understand and really think about musicals and recognize that for what it is. But much of the musical theater audience, and I'm not talking about in Kansas City, I'm not talking about the MTH audience, because our audience is actually really interesting and well educated. But much of the musical theater audience of the general public is going to be entertained, which is why the musicals were created in the first place, is just to entertain people. Which means that all of this challenging material that existed was either glossed over to get to the fun big song and dance number, or just written entirely out. And I find that gross. And it's something that I don't like to let happen anymore. I can't really alter the script, I can't alter the music, but I can make sure that as we're designing the show, we're paying attention to the fact that yes, there's a carousel on stage, but it's not a show about a carousel. Do you know what it does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Do you think plays do a better job?
I think that they do. I think that straight plays aren't. I think that in general, straight plays haven't been usually manipulated to the extent that musicals have been. There's not
Mm.
so many layers of producers and so many layers of marketing teams, because that is how things happen, to get through before you can put up a play. And honestly, there are a lot more plays that get written and produced because they don't take all of this volume of production that musicals do. So you have so many more plays by writers of color, plays by women, plays by people whose voices have traditionally been silenced in the arts. And musicals, they don't get the kind of funding that they need to produce a musical. They don't get the opportunity because everybody thinks it's a risk. And people typically associate musicals with being entertaining and not challenging. So the material that people are writing to challenge perceptions isn't being produced. I think that a beautiful exception to that is, of course, Hamilton. But I think that Hamilton does that really beautifully by simply existing. And at the same time, let's not forget that Hamilton is a story about a bunch of old white guys. It's
Yeah.
being told through a completely different lens, and that is part of what makes it really magical and important, is giving it that voice and recognizing that, like, the world doesn't just exist through white perception. but it is still a tale about white people.
That's true. And I, as you were talking, I was thinking, opera also has the same problem, because it's such a big thing. It's a big ordeal to put on an opera or a musical. And so it's always, play it safe, do what, is audiences are going to like instead of taking risks and exposing audiences to different voices.
Exactly. We're going to invest $1 million in a show that's going to run for one weekend. So we're going to make sure that it's not going to be something that's going to turn our audiences away.
Yeah. What do you think is there? I don't want to use the word solution, but what do you think would help that problem?
For me, it's about giving the opportunity for new works to exist. And it's so frustrating because often you find out about, like, this theater has a new works festival. Well, their new works show is less funded than most of the other shows in the season.
Hmm.
So it's like, okay, cool. Well, we're gonna do a show by a female writer of Asian descent. Cool, that's great. But we're only gonna give her a third of the budget that we would typically give a show in our season because it's in the New Works Festival and because it's a risk. Like, why? Why are you bothering? If you're gonna set this show up to be less funded, and therefore likely inherently less successful because there isn't the opportunity for exploration of mistakes, because, oh, by the way, it's a new work which really does needs the funding to be able to explore in the room, to explore in the rehearsal room, and to explore throughout the design process. Right, you find out something isn't working, you change it, 24 hours later you have to have a new scenic piece on stage. Well, why aren't you funding that process? And it's because you think it's a risk. Why do you think it's a risk? Because of racism. Like,
Hmm.
ugh. Sorry, I have strong feelings apparently.
I love it. Yeah, those are really good points. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, and those are the sort of the crux of my issue with musical theater in general, is because it, like you said, in opera is the same exact way, is that it doesn't lend itself to allowing people with new voices to participate. And we can change that by just assuming that that it has to work in a different way, which is why people have been saying, I'm not saying things that other people haven't been saying for a very long time. I'm just saying them here and now. Other people have said this far before I have, and much more eloquently.
Yeah, but no, I think it's an issue that needs to be talked about more. I mean, there's a lot of issues in the theater industry that need to be talked about more, and so I want to use this podcast as a platform that allows people to talk about that. If people are thinking it but not saying it, then change is slower to happen.
Yeah, or just doesn't.
Hmm. I like to talk to people who don't live in New York City, um, because I mean, New York City, it's a special place for theater. I don't think anyone would deny that. I'm not saying it's not, but there's so many other vibrant cities in the country that have vibrant theater scenes. So what have you liked about working in the Kansas City area?
Yeah, so my favorite thing about Kansas City is that I can do a ton of different stuff in this town. I can often in a week in Kansas City, I will leave work at MTH where I'm doing Forever Plaid, and then I will drive down to the Black Box that my friend Heidi Van owns, and I will start pinning drapes up in a certain way because she's looking for a specific look and she didn't quite know how to do it. And then I'll end up running over to the Unicorn because they needed help painting something. And it's not so much about the money, it's that, like, the Unicorn is doing a show that is so completely different from what's happening at the Black Box and completely different from what's happening at MTH. And it's like you can just bounce around and do all of this cool and interesting work. And then that evening, you could stop by the Rep and see, like, a massive, well-funded straight play or a different musical. The value of Kansas City theater is that if there's a kind of live production that you're looking for, you can find it. And if there's a type of performer or a type of designer that you're looking for, you can usually kind of find them here in Kansas City and then follow them around and see how they fit into all of these different boxes.
I would imagine, working in a little smaller scene, I would imagine there's less pressure. And I think when there's less pressure, sometimes it can get more creative. And I've definitely seen just some really phenomenal creativity in this area. And so I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. There's a huge benefit in Kansas City to being able to pay your bills.
Yeah. Yep.
as a theater artist, I'm really lucky, of course, because I'm on salary at a theater. But it's, people ask me all the time, and they asked me when I was finishing graduate school, are you going to move to New York? Are you going to move to Chicago? And my answer was always no. I don't want to go starve somewhere for 2 to 4 to 10 years in the hopes that I'll end up designing a show and that becomes my big break, and then until that big break runs out, and then I'm starving again until I find something else. Maybe if I'm lucky, like I would sort of rather live here in Kansas City, which is an incubator for new work and is an incubator for artists. A lot of people refer to Kansas City as a theater stepping stone, and exists as a part of this world and this establishment, and frankly, in the position that I'm currently in, help to change this establishment for the better.
Mm-hmm. What does a production manager do? What do you do?
So people ask me this question a lot, and my answer is that what I do and what other production managers do is probably very different. I was recently asked this question as a part of somebody's graduate thesis, and they asked me, am I missing any? At the end of the conversation, they said, "Am I missing any questions?" And I said, "You should ask every production manager if they think that their job is typical of what a production manager's job is." And I said, "You will probably get a different answer from every single person, which is the point." I, as a production manager at this organization, that is an important caveat. So what I typically do is I handle a lot of the contracting. So all of our contractors that come through. So that's our run crews, our designers, stage managers. All of that comes through me. I typically don't handle performer contracts. I don't know if that will change when I go back to work, because everything will be different. We'll all have to roll with the punches. So I handle all of the design, tech, and production contracting. I handle all of the a lot of the purchasing that goes through that department. I run all of the design meetings for the design and tech process. I typically am also trying to encourage people to think outside of what their perception is. You'll have somebody who comes in and they'll say, "Oh, I love this musical. This is my favorite musical, and I saw this production and they did this thing." I'm like, "That's really great. What were they trying to say with that thing, and can we push that even further?" Because our particular theater is not, we don't have a fly space. We seat, I think, 240 people, and our ceiling is like 14 feet tall, and it is concrete. We're not going to be, recreating the Broadway set or the Broadway production of the film or version of anything, but we can say the same thing. So that's a lot of what I end up doing, is encouraging design conversations to be a bit more experimental than they typically would have been in the past. Because the other thing is, like, because we don't have all of that space, we can do anything and sort of get away with it as long as the design concept is really solid and well thought out, which is fun. And then it gets into production, and I also function as the technical director and scenic charge here. So I end up doing all of the bill drawings for all of the shows. I end up handling the materials acquisition and then construction. I oversee a shop of usually one, sometimes it's three, to build the show. I handle all of the load-ins, all of the strikes, and paint and prop everything. I run tech typically. By run tech, I mean the stage manager runs tech, and I stand there and make sure that tech is flowing quickly and step in if the stage manager needs backup. Yeah, that's a lot of it. And then often, my boss Tim Scott will say, "I'm looking for this kind of designer, or this kind of person, or this kind of an artist to work on this show, and I can't find somebody. Do you know anybody?" And I happen to have really great resources in town and outside of town to bring in the kinds of people that we're looking for. If we're doing a show and we know we want to bring in a Black artist or a Black designer, and it's almost impossible to find a Black scenic designer in Kansas City, specifically because of the way that the systems of oppression have existed here. It's, can we reach outside of the city? Can we afford to bring in a Black scenic designer from outside? No. Okay, great. Well, then let's find an artist. And that means that I am going to end up doing a lot more drafting, but that's fine. So let's bring in an artist so that we can make sure the person telling the story is telling the story. And that's a lot of what ends up being my job as well, is making sure that we have the right people telling their own stories or participating in storytelling, so that we have the right lenses and the right viewpoints, which our audiences do find challenging. But typically, the blade of the knife is thin enough they don't realize it's slipping in.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot. That's not even covering my day to day. Imagine all the paperwork that comes with that.
Yeah. How do you keep track of all of that?
Badly. I do a bad job. So for me, it's all about lists, man. I'm good with a list. I'm good with a calendar. I'm not good with computers. We have a Google Calendar that we share at the organization, which is the only calendar that functions for me digitally. Is because I can always check and I can like tap out of all of the calendars I don't want to see, but I can tap into all the ones that I do. And I actually insisted that they change the calendars from department to space, so I can now see, like, I don't care, what whose department is doing what on any given day, but I care whose department is in what space on any given day at any given time. And that change alone, really made my life much easier. So yeah, there's that, and then receipt tracking is always difficult. So it's a lot of like training myself to take pictures of receipts immediately as soon as I do them, and lists all day. I am constantly surrounded by these sort of half-page yellow notepads that are just covered in lists. I also suffer from like really powerful anxiety and depression, and lists help me a lot with that because when I'm feeling anxious and I can't breathe, I get panic attacks a lot. I can step away, go to my office, sit down, and check everything off the list, or I can number the list and prioritize things. Which means that suddenly my anxiety brain, which can't focus on anything, can say number one is this, go do it. And then when you check things off and you scratch things off of the list, it's a reward. It's a dopamine reward, so it also combats my depression at the same time. Lists are my secret weapon to accomplishing all of the things that I need to do without sort of falling down a mental health rabbit hole on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. What do you like about the job?
I like everything about my job, and I really do mean that. Whenever I try to think about what I don't like about my job, I think the only thing I don't like is that we don't have more money to pay people. That's it. I wish that we could pay people every cent that I think that they deserve. I think about every artist in Kansas City in particular, which is a difficult city to work in. I think that every artist deserves to be making a lot more money, but we live in a world where federal organizations aren't granting to the arts the way that they do in other countries, and the city isn't granting to the arts the way that they do in a lot of other cities. And patrons expect a lot of bang for not a lot of buck. That becomes frustrating. So it's how can I, where can we reduce what to make sure that the artists are still getting paid as best as we possibly can. I'm very proud, and I know that Tim's very proud as well, that we are one of the better paying arts organizations in Kansas City, for designers at the very least. It's really sort of frustrating as an administrator because you meet all of these people in the city. I meet all of these performers who are in the orchestra, musicians in particular. It's so I remember being a freelancer. It was not that long ago, and it's hard. It's a hard life, and I think that audiences don't really realize that that's what the life is, because you're changing things so constantly. I think that the great thing about like the symphony in town, is that those workers are unionized, and they are, they're typically the same workers for every show that happens there, which is really great. But even so, I don't know. I just think that artists need to be paid better. I mean, let's as a specific example, like I've been doing this Tyrannosaurus dressing thing for a little over a month now, and at the end of this whole situation, I will have made less than $1,000 off of all of this, and my name is all over the place right now. It's all over the country. The images of my work are all over the country. It's probably going to end up being shown during the Super Bowl tomorrow, and I've made very little money off of this very high profile project. That's not to complain, but that's to point out, like, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. Like, the way that artists are thought of and are paid in this city and in many other cities isn't the way that I think the public perceives it.
Yeah. Yeah. So starting out as like a set designer and then going to production manager, that's not like a common route that people take, right?
No, typically it's stage managers that end up in production management positions, or it's technical directors who do. For me at MTH, it was all about they needed somebody who understood enough about all things to be able to talk to all departments intelligently and to be able to help solve problems. I've worked so much as a props master, particularly in Creed, Colorado. I have this huge stock of skills. I don't know if you've talked to any props masters on the podcast before, but you end up with this like massive collection of skills that you use for things all the time. And I've worked as a stitcher in a costume shop, and I've worked in lighting a lot. And I've, of course, run scene shops, and I run paint shops, and, I've done so many different kinds of things under the production umbrella that, for this particular organization that needed somebody who could manage all of those things, but also step in and do things when they needed to happen. I save MTH a lot of money by also being a passable technical director and a passable paint charge. It makes it very helpful to have somebody in this organization who could handle all of those things, because otherwise, that would have to be positions that would be hired out, and that's not always feasible on the kinds of budgets that we're functioning on, in Kansas City. And MTH isn't the only theater that does that. I know that there are a couple of other theaters in KC who have the same situation, where there's a single person who does a lot of the building and a lot of the painting and a lot of the props, simply because that's what can be afforded. One person's salary who has a lot of power to make sure that they're not being overworked, which is the important part, is much more feasible.
So would you recommend that people who are younger starting out try to, go deep or wide with their skill?
Ooh, girl, that depends where you want to end up.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think that if you want to be very, very successful as a designer, that you should really specialize. I'm not a great draftsman. I don't do really great renderings. I sort of balk at the idea of doing a really beautiful traditional design package, not because I'm incapable of it, because it's a lot of work that I don't have time for in this position. I expect it from my designers, but that's because of who I am. So if that's something that you want to do, if you want to be a designer in particular, if you want to end up working on Broadway, you want to work in the local theaters or in the regional circuit, then yeah, you really need to specialize and develop all of those designer skills, that don't necessarily affect production itself. I think that if you want to be a scenic designer, you should probably spend less time building scenery and more time learning how to be a really great draftsperson, or more time learning how to sketch in ways that communicate really beautifully. But if you want to be, a really versatile person who's a really versatile hire, and will always have a job in this industry, then going wide is your answer. It depends entirely, I think, on what you want to do and who you want to be in this world and where you want to end up. And admin, I don't know how you end up being an admin. I think you just do stuff until people think that you're responsible, and somehow somebody thought I was responsible.
Yeah. It sounds like you deal with a lot of people, and I like to ask, as a very introverted person myself, that's what I love about playing in the pit, is like I can talk to the musicians and that's kind of it. I can just stay in my little bubble. So I admire people who deal with people all day long and during the entire rehearsal process and whatnot. So dealing with people, dealing with difficult people, dealing with people with big personalities, how do you navigate all of the people that you have to work with on a day-to-day, on a normal, pre-COVID day-to-day basis?
Pre-COVID, post-COVID, I don't know. I'll have to figure it out. I'm gonna have to relearn a lot of stuff, actually.
Yeah, me too.
Pre-COVID, yeah. Pre-COVID, I think for me, a lot of it is it's empathy. I'm a sort of tragically empathetic person. I used to have a therapist. I'm looking for a new therapist. I don't think that's something anybody should ever be ashamed of talking about. So there's my disclaimer on therapy. Get therapy if you need therapy. Do it. It's fun. So my therapist used to tell me all the time, you don't have to see everything from everyone's point of view at all times. You're allowed to just have feelings, which was helpful because it was, really sort of stopping me from being a more effective version of myself. But as a person who deals with people all day, it's a really effective tool. I try to go into all of my interactions understanding what people are trying to accomplish, understanding that everybody is just trying to do their best at the end of the day, no matter what is happening. So yeah, that's the big thing for me, is like recognizing the humanity in all people who are participating. As far as interacting with people, I take big breaks. I'm also a lot of people think that I'm an extrovert. I am not. I value my alone time a lot. My boyfriend just the other day was making fun of me because I'm a good partner for 2 hours out of the day, and the rest I need my space, which is fine. That works for him. That works for us. But it's true in a professional setting as well. And I think it's for me, it's knowing what my boundaries are. And it took a long time for me to learn that, like, as a production manager, as a person with power in a situation, sometimes the best thing for me to do is just leave the room and let other people work without me there, so that because it can be frustrating and overwhelming and intimidating to have somebody who has decision making power in the room while you're experimenting and making artistic choices, and B, because everybody doesn't necessarily want people around while they're trying to go through that process. So yeah, learning to be around people is, I think the answer to your question is, I don't really know. It changes person to person.
One of the things that I've realized about this industry is that if you want to survive for any length of time, like as a professional trying to make a living, trying to, create art that you're proud of, you've really got to know yourself, and you've got to know how you recharge, and you've got to know what things wear you out and you've got to know, like, you just really, there's like a level of like self-awareness that you have in order to make it, or you're gonna burn out, because you haven't taken the time to recharge, or you can't handle these diva actresses,
Or diva designers, or diva directors, or diva production managers.
yeah. There's divas all over the industry.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. I've either been in school or working my entire career. I realized very early, I was really lucky that I realized in high school that I wanted to do this for a living. But this thing that they tell us as a designer, and I don't know if they tell you this as musicians in the pit as well, it would make sense if they do, is that if you're too specific, if you have too strong a voice, you are actually harder to hire. You're harder to work with. So yeah, you spend a lot of time in theater school as a designer learning how to kill your style, kill your voice, and make yourself more marketable and more accessible by being less specific and less individual. And the problem with that is that you start to devalue your own voice, you start to devalue your own art, and it gets hammered so effectively by faculty and by supervisors that it becomes second nature. So one of the things that I am talking to people a lot, and that I do a lot of right now, is art that is just for me, that has nothing to do with theater. I've learned a lot about myself by doing that. So when I was working in Florida and I had that very, very difficult job where I was being told in pretty specific terms that I wasn't the kind of artist that they were looking for, and I wasn't the kind of person they were looking for in that position. I would go home because I was feeling completely artistically drained, and I would take all of these self portraits of myself, it's like a step above an Instagram photo. And there's something that I've learned is pretty specific to the queer community, is we're not afraid to like glue a bunch of flowers to our heads and take photos in pink light. Um, as a form of self-expression, and it turned into this whole series and this whole like second Instagram moment. I eventually married those two Instagram accounts. I learned through going through that whole process that as a scenic designer, I had been avoiding things that I thought were too specific to me. I would have been avoiding materials that I found exciting or interesting because I was afraid of being put into that queer person box, or being the scenic designer who's too gay or too flashy, or who puts sparkly stuff on every set. And now, having gone through that process and having gone through, like, frankly, a pandemic that stopped me from producing theater at all, I've decided that idea that I need to be really, sort of versatile as a scenic designer and neutral in a way that's really hireable is not going to work for me anymore. And it's not what people get excited about when they talk to me. It's not what people get excited about when I'm designing. It's, it is my voice that they care about, and that people value and that people want to pay for. So developing that has been beneficial for me in the short term. I'm much happier as an artist. I'm much happier as a designer, and in the long term, because it's already drastically affected the way that I think about design. It's been a while since I put a wall on stage. I just don't design walls into scenery, and now I've taken the time to really realize that, like, it's not that I have an aversion to walls, it's that I have an aversion to a flat, immobile surface. If I can create something that is just composed of glowing or translucent shapes on string that undulate and shift in the space and in changing light, or that glow or that sparkle, or that or that it's a giant pool of water that changes colors, suddenly, like, that to me is so much more exciting than what people want. And the problem with that, of course, is that as a designer, I can't render for you exactly what I think it's going to look like. If I think that the scenery should just be a wall of fog and colored light, I can't tell you exactly what that wall of fog and colored light is going to look like, because it's going to change constantly, which some people find very, very frustrating because it's not how we're supposed to work, and some people find very exciting because it's. I'm not saying that I'm doing something that nobody has done before, because many people have done what I'm doing before, but I don't know. I think it's cool to bring into cities like Kansas City. I don't typically take inspiration from other scenic designers or architects, which is unusual. That's where most scenic designers get their inspiration. Architects, scenic designers, or sculptors. I take my inspiration from fashion designers.
Mm.
So I've been leaning a lot into the work of Ines van Herpen lately. She's an incredible couture designer out of the Netherlands who is really famous for creating these clothes that move. They move on the body. They're based in rhythm and repetition and in biological forms. She's very into creatures that you find under the sea that don't have any bones, um, and the way that water and wind and air move, and finding ways to create that in a wearable form. And I think that if I can embrace that same sort of idea of active and mobile and difficult to nail down in scenery, then I'm creating a much more interesting world.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds interesting. I'm trying to visualize that as you're talking, and I'm like, huh.
It's hard to explain. It's hard to visualize. It's a lot of, like, me sending pictures of, or short videos of water trickling overlaid with 1970s film sets, and saying it's like this, but if it was this thing.
It's a tricky balance because, in any situation you're in as an artist, you're bringing your voice and your personality and your demeanor, but you also have to find a way to fit that into the group and make sacrifices to your voice in order to help the bigger whole. So yeah, I think it's an interesting balance to try to figure out, when you're thrown into a new situation with new people. And
Yeah, well, and it's people say all the time in the theater industry that we're the best collaborators in the world, and I think that that's true. I think that theater people collaborate better than many people. I think that we sort of need to be able to say in situations more effectively when a collaboration is just not happening, and give ourselves permission to tap out of it. Yeah, I know it's a weird sort of overarching theater and art community, anything to do with performance art, really, situation is like, how do I collaborate at all times while still holding on to the important part of the vision that everybody embraced early on. And what do you do when that collaboration isn't happening?
mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's a delicate thing.
Yeah, delicate is a perfect word to describe it.
Awesome. So I have one last question that I like to ask everyone, and that's advice to young people who want to do what you do. So you could take this set designer way, production manager way, whichever path you want to go down. But advice to young people who want to do what you do.
Sure, I'm gonna take it down a designer path, because that's sort of the easiest. I don't think I'm the qualified person to give advice on being a production manager. There are much better production managers, well, there are much better designers in the world. I think my advice for a young person who wants to be a scenic designer in this world and wants to be a scenic designer in a way that's interesting and exciting to people is to be an artist first. And I mean that in every sense of the way. I think that it's important to find your artistic voice, find who you are as an artist and what kind of art excites you, and then find a way to make that live in this world. The best scenic designers that I know didn't do theater in high school and then theater in undergrad. They are, artists or architects or jewelry designers who then ended up going to graduate school for scenic design because they fell in love with the medium. And I think that that's the thing, that's the secret in this world that we don't tell young people and young theater people in general, is that, like, it's great that you can build that flat really beautifully. That's a really handy skill. But if you want to be a great scenic designer, you need to be spending a little bit more time at the art museum, or you need to be spending a little bit more time, watching Paris couture fashion shows and whatever it is that excites you. I like to watch a lot of nature documentaries about animals underwater. Like, find the things that excite you artistically, and then embrace those sorts of things. That doesn't mean that you need to turn every scenic design into a whale, but but it does mean that you need to identify what it is that excites you as an artist and be able to. And I don't mean medium. I mean the bare essence of the things that excite you, and then be able to embrace those things as a designer, because that's what people will react to. If people will react to the thing about the subject matter you're interested in that really resonates with you, because it's resonating with them too.
The music for the backstage creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Carly Wagner.